Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Macedonia here. I had the opportunity to look over all of your literature review outlines, and I just wanted to hop on to make a video and provide all of you just some generalized feedback as you guys are really developing your literature review drafts this week. So on my screen here, you see this is the critical assignment for the literature review. And so I wanted to be able to highlight a couple important areas for all of you to really keep in mind as you're writing your drafts. So within this critical assignment, you see that these are headings that are provided to guide you in terms of how you develop your literature review. So you see that it has the introduction where you're providing a description of your topic broadly, and then you're narrowing it down into your specific topic of interest, including your rationale and significance. Then you go into your theme analysis. So when I provided a lot of you feedback about your theme analysis, this is your meat of your literature review. So this is where, as a researcher and practitioner, you are having the opportunity to show that you're an expert within this topic by providing the breadth and scope for the available research in this area. You are synthesizing that information, and from that, you are identifying the major gaps and limitations of the available research. From the gaps and limitations of this research, that's where your study emerges. So one of the biggest areas of feedback that I had looking at the literature review outlines is that it seems like many of you looked at the exemplar and modeled your outlines from the exemplars, in which you're aligning your research questions first and then going into your literature review. And I'm really going to challenge you to actually change that perspective. Because again, your literature review is what is driving, showing the limitations and the gaps. And from there, that is where your research questions emerge. So, and then after you're highlighting the gap, you're talking about how your study is going to address those gaps, as well as outlining the purpose and your research questions, as well as providing your research method that's most suitable. So in terms of your outlines, where you have your research questions and methods, many of you, like I said, included at the top, you are going to move that at the bottom. So I'm going to actually show you how I kind of frame this. So I'm actually going to show you on one side of my screen, this is an outline, a very quick and dirty outline that I just created from my own chapter 2 of my dissertation. And again, this is a little bit different, but I wanted you to be able to see kind of what this is going to look like when you're transferring your outline to your actual chapter draft. So you see on my outline, when I'm going into my introduction, my topic is looking specifically at school-based administrators and the need for them to be adequately prepared in their ed leadership programs to work with special education teachers. So you see in my introduction from my outline, I am first defining school-based administrators. I'm going to be describing the various roles and responsibilities, including special education. And I'm even going to be supporting my statements around this with evidence from literature. Again, this is not a personal essay. I am not inserting my opinions. I am providing factual information from previous research. I'm also outlining the purpose of the chapter. So something critical that I want to point out, the purpose of my literature review is not the same purpose as my study. So I'm going to say that one more time. The purpose of my literature review is not the same as my purpose of my study. The purpose of my literature review is to explore these topics of interest, to be able to see what available research there is in terms of school-based administrator preparation and special education. So I outlined all of those points within my introduction and included some of my citations. So these points within my chapter, these are my themes that I'm exploring in my thematic analysis. So after I've collected all of my research, just like all of you did within your annotated bibliography, these are the themes that I'm going to be talking about. So number one, I'm going to be talking about the evolving roles and responsibilities of school-based administrators. Number two, I'm going to be describing special education legislation and the impact of their responsibilities in terms of school-based administrators. Number three, I'm going to be talking about administrative support of special education teachers. And lastly, I'm going to be reviewing the research regarding school-based administrator preparation and special education. So those are my main themes. So I also first segue into gender and school level, because these are specific things that I wanted to explore. So I present this information, again, utilizing citations to support my statements. So I'm talking about the fact that white women are still very dominant within the teaching profession. However, within this there is a underrepresentation of women in school leadership positions. And I also talk about how, again, the teaching profession primarily is female in both elementary and secondary. And I talk about how there are limitations with this. Then you see in my thematic analysis, those four things that I talked about earlier in my introduction, again, because this is framing exactly what I'm going to be talking about. These are going to be my main headings, and I'm going to be showing this to you, and I'm actually showing you the chapter 2. So first, I talk about the evolving school-based administrator roles and responsibilities. So I have a little introductory sentence, and then I go into the major roles and responsibilities that I talk about. And again, I'm using evidence from the literature to support my statements. That's my number one heading, okay? Or I should say this is my second level heading. Then my second theme that I'm talking about is special education legislation and the impact that it has on school-based administrator roles and responsibilities. So I talk about the No Child Left Behind. I talk about IDEA. And then I talk about how school-based administrators, regardless of their training, are responsible for carrying out those capabilities because of those laws. So I go into greater detail about that, and again, using evidence from the text. Then I go into school-based administrator support. And I want to point out that within this course, you're not required to outline a theoretical or conceptual framework, but that definitely will be something that will be revisited when you get to your proposal class. So I want to point out that in this section that you'll see, I have included my theoretical conceptual framework, which is House's theory within this. So you are going to see that. Again, that is not a requirement for that class. My third major heading within the thematic analysis is the need for school-based administrator preparation. So in this section, I'm talking about what evidence in the literature has there been related to educational leadership preparation, specifically within special education. So I talk about the major kind of contributions that I found within the literature. So for example, I talk about how school-based administrators talk about how they're underprepared to provide leadership to special education. And so this is, supported through evidence from previous literature, noting that school-based administrators may have like lack of knowledge regarding roles and responsibilities of special education teachers. They don't know anything about providing effective instructional practices, etc. Then this is the thematic analysis that I've done. Okay, so then with all of that I have really looked at in terms of looking at the literature holistically, then I'm noting the shortcomings of research. So this is where I'm talking about the gaps and limitations. So in terms of the literature that I examined for this literature review, I looked at existing literature from 2002 to present, and there's 20 studies that I looked at specifically. And I note, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I note 4 major limitations. So these 4 major limitations are what is going to justify the need for my study, okay? So first, the first limitation that I talk about, the majority of studies have examined school-based administrator perceptions from the view of principals. So I note that as a limitation. So there isn't a lot of information regarding perceptions of assistant principals. So this is, again, important when I'm thinking about limitations and what my study can contribute. The second limitation I know is that there are limitations regarding school-based administrator school level and demographics, specifically gender. So I talk about, again, how women are the primary force within the teaching profession, but there's an underrepresentation of women in leadership. So I talk about how there's a gap in terms of that, as well as looking specifically at school level being elementary. Then I note that there's a limitation in terms of methodology, in terms of how this has been studied. And I provided feedback around methodology for a lot of you in terms of looking at your studies to see how your studies have been conducted. So in my case, the primary form that data has been collected has been through survey research. So I present this as a limitation. So I state that this limits gaining very deep perspectives from participants. So this warrants further investigation. So lastly, because of these gaps, then I segue into implications for future research. So I talk about holistically that these limitations really warrant a qualitative investigation to examine female elementary assistant principals and their university-based preparation related to supervision of special education. So I state that due to these limitations, that is where the purpose of my study comes in. That is how I am addressing the gaps and limitations. Then I am stating the purpose of my study. So the purpose of my study is to investigate female school-based administrators, specifically assistant principals, perceptions of their roles and responsibilities in regard to special education and how their university-based preparation influence their knowledge, skills, and practices in providing administrative support. The only thing that's different between this outline and your outline is that within your assignment for your literature review, you have to include your research questions. When I show you my chapter 2, I did not include my research questions. So my last sentence, I stated that chapter 3 will provide an extensive overview of research questions, research design, participants, data collection, data analysis, etc. So I did not state my research design, so I would add a qualitative investigation in the form of a multiple case study design. So that was the design that I used for my dissertation. So what I want to do now is I want to show you how this outline translates to the actual chapter 2 that I am going to show you. Oops, I went too far. So within my introduction, again, I have shared with all of you that within your introduction, you are introducing your topic broadly and then narrowing it down to your topic of interest. So again, I define school-based administrators. I introduce this broadly, that they have a lot of roles and responsibilities, but regardless of their background or experience, they have additional responsibilities in the area of special education. So I, again, bring about previous literature that talks about how school-based administrators that have a background in special education are better able to provide for special education programming. And what I want to note here is that I include the problem. So the problem is that few school-based administrators are prepared to support special education programming, okay? So also outlining that previous research has demonstrated the need for school-based administrators to receive specialized preparation, okay? Then here is my purpose. This purpose is going to look very familiar to this outline. Again, my purpose is not the purpose of my study. The purpose that I have is the purpose of this literature review. So the purpose of the literature review is to explore, again, these 4 things. Then the chapter concludes with the focus of gaps in research to inform future research. Okay, so just like the outline that I showed you, the first subheading, again, level 2 subheading, is gender and school level and school-based administration. Okay, so I go into a lot more detail in terms of the roles and responsibilities that I reviewed with you. Okay, so I'm here. So this is the thematic analysis. So I'm in the thematic analysis, and you see that throughout what I am talking about within the roles and responsibilities. So I'll just stop here. Is I am using the literature to support my statements, okay? So again, I'm not inserting my opinion. This is not a personal essay. I'm inserting support from the research to support the statements that I'm making, okay? So that is my first theme that I talk about. Here's my second theme. The second theme is talking about special education legislation. So again, I talk about and connect the special ed legislation and the roles and responsibilities of school-based administrators using evidence from the research to support what I'm talking about. Okay. Here's my third theme that I go to: school-based administrative support and special education teachers. Okay. So that's my third theme. Again, I'm going into a lot more detail within this chapter than I did in my outline. Like, for example, emotional support. This is emotional support. Within your literature review, you can create tables and figures to support your narrative. That is totally fine. So these are 4 dimensions of support that I'm specifically talking about. So I created a table that defines each of those areas of support. I'm going to scroll a little bit forward because, again, this is my theoretical conceptual framework. Again, these are pertinent findings from previous studies that I'm using. So I'm going to go a little bit ahead. So again, I'm still in administrative support. Okay, so my last major area that I'm talking about is I'm presenting the necessity for school-based administrators to receive preparation. So I'm documenting across studies, this is what's been found in terms of school-based administrator preparation, specifically in special education. So I'm presenting those findings within my literature review. So again, this is presenting what's already been conducted, because again, like my study, the purpose of my study has to extend or add to the existing literature. So this is the shortcomings of available research, okay? So if you are following the headings of the major assignment, this would be the conclusion. However, I want to give you autonomy in case you want to change the headings. You don't have to use conclusion. You can use something else. So I use shortcomings of available research. So again, I talk about each one of these limitations that I reviewed, okay? For example, first, perceptions of principles. That was a gap or limitation. Okay, so I present each one. Implications for future research. So within this section, I reinforce the limitations that I've noted. So you'll see several areas for potential next steps. So these are going to mirror those limitations that I had stated. So then, holistically, these limitations warrant a qualitative investigation to examine female elementary assistant principals and their university-based preparation, okay? So that is my conclusion statement. So then I go into chapter 3, will provide an extensive overview of the research questions, research design, participants, et cetera. So you'll see when I segue to chapter 3, here are my research questions. So with this, for your critical assignment, it's asking you to provide the research purpose and research questions, okay? So if I wanted to put my research questions within, oops, forgot one. Within my chapter 2, I would holistically, these limitations warrant a qualitative investigation. So again, it's asking a clear and concise paragraph outlining the research purpose and research questions. To examine female elementary assistant principals and their university-based preparation. So after my purpose of my study, I could include my research questions at the bottom and go into more detail about my proposed methodology. Okay, so your proposed methodology. Within my dissertation, you'll see that my chapter 3 goes into more detail about that. So I really hope that this was helpful. Again, I'm really sorry about the length of this video, but I really, really wanted to be able to provide you some great feedback and ideas of how to transition your outline into your actual literature review. Please, please, please reach out to me if you have any questions. I would love to meet with you to discuss this further. I hope you have a really great rest of your day.